Once an organization's risks are understood, it's important that appropriate action is taken to address these risks to ensure that the organization's objectives are protected or enhanced. Some risks are severe enough to require immediate action. Others can be dealt with in the short term, whereas some risks require longer-term attention over months or even years. This session explores the key ideas and terms associated with addressing risks and outlines the steps to take to ensure that the appropriate action is taken once a risk is identified, concentrating on 5 main options: avoid, tolerate, treat, transfer, and terminate. The first phase of the risk assessment system is designed to ensure that we understand the risks the organization faces. In the second, we address those risks to ensure that appropriate action is taken to minimize downside risks and exploit any upside risks. In this context, we define address as any actions taken to ensure that the organization's objectives are protected or enhanced in light of the risks faced. Prioritization is key to the success of this activity, as the organization must address risks in order of severity to protect its objectives. Also bear in mind that you won't be able to address all the risks immediately, so you will have to look at short and longer term objectives for addressing your risks as shown here. Note that the example timeframes here are simply illustrative and should be adjusted to suit the organization. But you could still break your actions down into shorter term objectives. For example, dealing with any emerging issues or crises, ensure that legal and regulatory requirements are met, ensure downside risks do not exceed the organization's risk tolerance, and exploit any immediate opportunities. In the mid to long term, you'd be looking to ensure downside risks do not exceed the organization's risk appetite, implement steps to make all risks as low as reasonably possible, and optimize upside risks. The primary activity in the address phase is determining the appropriate action to take for each risk and subsequently developing action plans to address these. Risk action plans will include a series of short-term and longer-term actions with the overall aim of protecting or supporting the organization's objectives. Here you will see 2 actions in the short-term objectives that might not immediately seem to fit within the risk management purview: addressing any legal requirements and responding to any issues or crises. Although these 2 activities may not fall within the risk manager's responsibilities, a thorough risk assessment may identify a slow-moving or emerging issue. Similarly, the assessment might also uncover instances where laws or regulations are not being complied with. Both situations would negatively impact the organization's objectives and require immediate action, so it's important to highlight these for action if discovered. Some technical terms have already crept in, so let's define these before we go any further. Risk appetite is the amount of risk that an organization is comfortable with on a day-to-day basis. Risk tolerance is the amount of risk an organization can bear for a short period of time. For organizations with a lower risk appetite, the gap between appetite and tolerance is likely to be relatively narrow. Organizations with a higher risk appetite may be willing to tolerate very high levels of risk for short periods of time. As low as reasonably possible defines a level after which it would be too expensive or disruptive to reduce the risk any further. In other words, from a cost-benefit perspective, the cost of any additional risk mitigation measures don't justify the benefits. The risk assessment process has helped us identify, assess, and prioritize risks, which gives us an order in which these should be addressed. However, before we do that, we need to understand what options are available to help us address risks. There are several different techniques for addressing risks, but many of these boil down to a variation of the 4 T's: tolerate, treat, transfer, and terminate. We will use a similar approach with the addition of one other option, avoid, and summarize this as A4T. These terms can be used to describe the general approach to addressing a risk in a clear, understandable way. Having an agreed set of terms makes the development of risk management plans more straightforward and ensures that everyone involved in the discussion understands the general strategy being proposed. Note that these terms do not define a strict set of actions, and sometimes a combination of activities is necessary. A4T gives us a basic set of options we can use to design strategies to address risks. These options present different approaches to managing a risk and can be used individually or in combination depending on the circumstances. To help explore these options in more detail, we'll use one of the risks from the XYZ Co-risk assessment shown here. First, avoiding a situation is sometimes the only strategy available to address a risk, particularly when the threat is something pervasive and completely outside the control of the organization. For example, coastal erosion or terrorism are both threats about which a company can do little, and no matter what additional measures are put in place, the resultant risks may remain too high to tolerate. Relocating a site or ending operations in the threatened area avoids the threat and negates the risk altogether. This may not be an option for mature operations and may be more appropriate in the early stages of a project, but avoiding a risk altogether should not be discounted as a potential option. In our example, the civil unrest in Jamwick is ongoing, and there's no real opportunity to physically relocate the facility in the short term. Jamwick is critical to the organisation's overall business objectives, so the company's senior leadership don't see a way in which they can avoid the risk at this stage. If a risk falls below the organisation's risk appetite, it should be something that the organisation can tolerate, even if it's not as low as reasonably possible. In the longer term, reducing all risks to as low as reasonably possible should still be an objective, but a risk that can be tolerated would not be a priority for action if more severe risks exist. A risk that exceeds risk appetite but not risk tolerance could be accepted for a short period of time, but this would still require treatment in the long term. Take care to ensure that in circumstances where an organisation is tolerating higher levels of risk, that it is not actually dealing with live issues which require immediate attention. During the assessment, the company assessed the risk in Jamwick as high, which exceeds its risk appetite, so the risk cannot be tolerated in the long term. In the short term, the risk will have to be tolerated, but it is prioritised for action. At some point, most risks require treatment. Treatment will focus on priority risks in the short term, but treatment plans to reduce all risks to as low as reasonably possible should be part of long-term risk planning. Risk treatment is the activity that probably takes up most time, as determining the most effective way to treat a risk can require a significant amount of research and planning. As discussed, an organisation can normally only influence its vulnerability to an event, or the event's impact, so treatment plans would normally focus around manipulation of one of these elements. Here you can see some examples of potential treatment options that XYZ Co is developing for the risk in Jamwick. Transferring or sharing risks is another common strategy, either through insurance, by outsourcing activities, or partnering with another organisation. Each of these options offsets an organisation's share of the risk, but these benefits come with additional challenges. Outsourcing and partnering require careful consideration to ensure new risks are not being created. For example, what precautions do you have in place to ensure that a subcontractor is not breaking the law? Do you have quality control in place to ensure they're not using substandard materials? When you partner with another organisation, you add the complexity of two management teams, two perspectives, and potentially two different sets of objectives. So while you may have reduced the original risk by outsourcing or partnering, you may have created other risks in the process. Following the assessment, an action is identified to review any insurance that applies to operations in Jamwick and to look at other options to transfer some risk via additional insurance. Although the CEO is opposed to selling off the Jamwick facility, outsourcing this part of the operation is an option. There may be additional business efficiencies with this course of action, and this is recorded as a longer-term option for consideration. The final option might be to terminate an activity where risks cannot be reduced to an acceptable level. This is not the same as avoiding the risk, where the activity continues under different, more acceptable circumstances. Terminate means that the activity must end completely. Prohibition of the use of DDT as a pesticide in the United States, and the end of Arctic drilling by some oil and gas companies are examples where the high degree of risk led to the termination of an activity altogether. The company feels that between the treatment and transfer options they have identified, they should be able to bring the risk in Jamwick to an acceptable level, so there is no need to consider terminating activity at this stage. So now we have the toolkit of 5 options: avoid, tolerate, treat, transfer, or terminate. But how do we actually manage the process to address our risks? The overall process for addressing risks can be broken into 6 steps. This process ensures that actions are taken in the correct order and most importantly, that the right stakeholders and decision makers are included at the right stage of the process. Some of the elements here touch on risk governance, which we'll look at in more detail separately, but it's important to note that oversight, high-level decision-making, audit and review are all important hallmarks of effective risk management. These 6 steps of the process are: review the assessment and agree the priorities for action, outline potential courses of action for each risk, conduct a peer review of the proposed strategies, decide on the appropriate course of action for each risk, consolidate feedback into a risk action plan, and finally execute the plan and take action. Depending on the organisation, this whole process could last weeks or months, and in some circumstances, executing the action plan could take years. The objective is still to address risks as quickly and effectively as possible, but it's important to be aware of the time that may be necessary to shepherd this process through a busy organisation. One important point to bear in mind is that the longer the period from risk assessment to executing the strategy, the greater the chance that the situation may develop and risks could change. So let's go on and look at each stage in the process in more detail. First, we prioritise risks for action using the results of the risk assessment. Importance will be determined by the overall value for each risk, but this should also broadly align with the priorities of addressing ongoing incidents or issues, dealing with any regulatory or legal breaches, addressing risks that exceed risk tolerance, and addressing risks that exceed risk appetite. If these conditions are all met, then the risks will be worked through in priority order with the objective of reducing each risk to as low as reasonably possible. Once an order to address the risks has been determined, potential courses of action can be considered. The risk owner, along with any process owners, will review the risk and determine which of the A4T options may be applicable. They will then develop courses of action that would address each risk, consulting with other stakeholders about these options. Similar to the need for consultation during the risk assessment, there's a need for wide consultation when developing strategies. Without consultation and consideration, the actions taken to address a risk may result in additional problems or be impractical to implement, so the owners of key risks and processes should be involved. This is not the same as the peer review of the final set of strategies, but there will be some natural overlap between these two activities. Another benefit of wide consultation is that you might find mitigation measures that address a range of issues. There are 3 additional points to consider when developing strategies. First, be data-driven. Present the key facts and figures to help compare and weigh the different options available. Include a comparison of the initial or raw risk versus the estimated post-action risk. Include an outline of costs, resources, and time required to help with cost-benefit analysis. Second, present the key information in a standard format. Specify the main approach using the A4T abbreviations and include a short summary of the overall strategy. Remember, you're only trying to identify options at this stage, so you don't need a complete solution, just enough to guide the decision makers. Finally, refine the options, but don't overplan. The management of any organisation is normally starved of time, so presenting them with all potential options for each risk would be overwhelming. Present the most viable options, but be careful not to streamline too much and don't just present your own preferred option. This may seem like a lot of effort only to generate options rather than a detailed strategy, and this part of the process can definitely be time-consuming. However, thorough development of options and wide consultation at this stage makes it much more likely that the eventual strategy will be successful, and effort now will make it easier to implement these solutions in the future. Once strategies have been identified, these can then be formally peer-reviewed by the organisation's key functions. The peer review is not the forum for final decision-making, but this is an opportunity to identify overlaps, dependencies, or where a particular strategy may have unintended consequences. Feedback during peer review may require a strategy to be refined, or objections may have to be noted for consideration by final decision-makers. Agreement on an appropriate strategy will be taken by the risk owner or a risk committee. Minor risks are normally addressed by the owner, but organisations should also specify that more serious risks need to be elevated for more senior consideration. The forum for this is a risk committee, and these usually exist at various levels within an organisation up to board level. The risk manager must be aware of where the ultimate decision for a risk lies and any applicable timeline, as some committees may only meet at specific intervals. The decision makers will use the strategy summaries and cost-benefit analyses to determine the most appropriate approach for each risk in the overall context of the business's objectives. Remember, you're now moving from pure risk management into business decision making, which brings additional factors into play. Once a decision is made, this must be recorded in the risk report or risk register, so it is clear what approach is being taken, along with the details of when the decision was made and by whom. Once the strategy for each risk has been agreed, this should be developed into a detailed action plan. These action plans will be project plans in their own right and should specify the actions, owners, and deadlines for each step required to put the agreed strategy into effect. The risk owner, not the risk manager, owns these individual action plans, but the risk manager should have a top-level plan of his or her own to monitor progress for each risk. This allows the risk manager to keep track of progress and ensure the overall risk strategy is on track. While executing the action plan, the risk owner should monitor its effects to ensure the strategy is effective. Even if the overall risk might not reduce immediately, the effects of the strategy should still indicate whether or not steps are being effective. As risk strategies advance or are completed, the revised situation can be incorporated into the next phase of reviews or assessment and the risks recalculated. Assuming that the strategy has been effective, that particular risk action can be considered closed and should be recorded as such in the risk register. Where a strategy has not achieved its said objective, a revised strategy may be necessary. So as you address your risks, you move from the theoretical to the practical, translating the findings of the risk assessment into actionable steps that will help protect or enhance your organization's objectives. The assessment provides the prioritization for action to ensure the most severe risks are tackled first, and these are then addressed using one of the 5 A4T options. Utilizing the 6-step process ensures that all actions are undertaken in the correct sequence, that strategies have input from around the business, and that decisions are made at the appropriate level, ensuring that the organization's objectives are protected or enhanced. So that brings us to the end of the session. Now you're ready to move forward and plan strategies to address your risk and put these into actions within your organization. Thanks for attending the session and good luck with your planning.